The last photo on Emily Harrison's phone showed her husband David adjusting their tent stakes while she rubbed her 7-month pregnant belly, both of them grinning at the camera with the twisted silhouettes of Joshua trees stretching behind them in the golden hour light. The timestamp reads 6:47 p.m., October 12, 2013. By sunrise the next morning, it was as if they had never existed. Their campsite at Hidden Valley in Joshua Tree National Park looked like a movie set after the actors had gone home. Tent perfectly erected, sleeping bags neatly arranged, camp stove still containing the remnants of what appeared to be their dinner. Emily's prenatal vitamins sat in a neat row on the picnic table next to David's reading glasses. Their rental car was parked exactly where they'd left it, keys still in the ignition, Emily's purse on the passenger seat with her phone showing 17 missed calls from her worried mother. The only thing missing was David and Emily Harrison themselves. For 11 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling missing person cases in National Park Service history. Despite extensive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, helicopter flyovers, and ground-penetrating radar, no trace of the couple was ever found. No clothing, no bones, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where two adult humans, one of them heavily pregnant, could have vanished in the middle of the night from a secured campground. The official theory was exposure and disorientation. Maybe they'd gone for a late night walk and gotten lost in the desert darkness. Maybe Emily had gone into premature labor and David had tried to carry her to get help, only to become lost himself. Desert terrain was unforgiving, especially to inexperienced hikers, and bodies could disappear quickly in the harsh environment. But experienced searchers knew that theory had holes. Pregnant women don't typically go for midnight desert hikes. David Harrison was an Eagle Scout and experienced outdoorsman who wouldn't have left their campsite without taking water, a flashlight, and his GPS unit, all of which were found untouched in their tent. And most importantly, there was no blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence that anything violent had occurred at their campsite. It was as if David and Emily Harrison had simply stepped out of existence. Until October 15, 2024, when a solo hiker named Marcus Rodriguez was exploring a rarely visited section of the park, following a wash that most tourists never saw. Rodriguez was an experienced desert navigator who'd been hiking Joshua Tree for over 20 years. But even he almost missed what would become the breakthrough that investigators had been waiting over a decade to find. Wedged between two boulders in a narrow canyon, partially buried by 11 years of flash floods and wind-blown sand, Rodriguez found a small metal object that looked like it had been deliberately hidden. When he brushed away the debris, he realized he was looking at a damaged digital camera, and suddenly, the mystery of what happened to David and Emily Harrison was about to be solved in the most disturbing way possible. Because the photos on that camera didn't just show what happened to a young couple and their unborn child on a camping trip in 2013, they revealed something far more sinister, a network of people who viewed isolated campers not as visitors to be protected, but as opportunities to be exploited. David and Emily Harrison should have been the perfect example of responsible camping. Both 31 years old, both experienced outdoors enthusiasts, both excited about sharing their love of nature with the child Emily was carrying. David was a software engineer from Portland who'd been hiking since childhood. Emily was a high school biology teacher who'd turned her students on to environmental conservation through hands-on wilderness experiences. Their trip to Joshua Tree was meant to be a baby-moon, a final adventure as a couple before becoming a family of 3. They'd planned meticulously, reserved their campsite months in advance, packed carefully with Emily's pregnancy in mind, and chosen October specifically because the desert temperatures would be comfortable for someone in her third trimester. Emily's sister Jessica had been texting with her throughout the day on October 12th, receiving regular updates about their drive from LA, their arrival at the park, and their excitement about their first night camping under what David kept calling the most incredible starscape you've ever seen. The last text Emily sent was at 9:23 p.m. David's making me hot chocolate on the camp stove. Baby's kicking like crazy. I think she's excited about her first camping trip. Love you. See you in a few days. Jessica tried calling Emily the next morning when she didn't receive her usual good morning text. No answer. She tried again an hour later, then again. By noon, when Emily still hadn't responded to calls or texts. Something that had never happened during her pregnancy when she was religious about staying in contact. Jessica called the park service. The ranger who took Jessica's initial report wasn't particularly concerned. Cell service in Joshua Tree was spotty at best, and plenty of campers went off grid for a day or two without cause for alarm. But Jessica insisted that something was wrong. Emily was 7 months pregnant and neurotic about staying in touch with family, especially with her mother, who called every morning to check on the pregnancy. When rangers arrived at the Harrisons' campsite that afternoon, they immediately understood Jessica's concern. The scene was too perfect, too undisturbed. If David and Emily had left their campsite voluntarily, even for a short hike, they would have secured their food against animals, taken water bottles, locked their car. Instead, everything was exactly as it would be if two people had simply vanished in the middle of ordinary activities. Emily's book, A Pregnancy Guide, was open on the picnic table with her reading glasses folded on top. David's hiking boots were neatly placed outside their tent, as if he'd been wearing camp shoes. The camp stove still contained the remnants of what appeared to be hot chocolate, though it had long since gone cold. Most disturbing was what investigators found inside their tent. Emily's maternity clothes were neatly folded, and her phone showed she'd been researching baby names right up until 10:47 p.m. David's phone contained photos he'd taken throughout their first day, including several of Emily laughing as she tried to get comfortable in their camp chairs while accommodating her pregnant belly. There was absolutely no indication that either David or Emily had left their tent after settling in for the night. The search for the Harrisons became one of the largest missing person operations in Joshua Tree's history. Within 48 hours, over 200 volunteers joined Park Service personnel, sheriff's deputies, and specialized search and rescue teams in combing nearly 50 square miles of desert terrain. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the most likely areas where lost hikers might be found. Search dogs were brought in to follow any potential scent trails. For 2 weeks, the search continued with decreasing intensity but no decreasing hope. Emily's pregnancy added urgency. Even if the couple had somehow gotten lost, a woman in her third trimester couldn't survive long in desert conditions without water and shelter. Every day that passed made survival less likely and the mystery more baffling. The investigation expanded beyond simple search and rescue. Detectives interviewed other campers who'd been in the area looking for anyone who might have seen or heard unusual activity on the night of October 12th. They examined the Harrisons' financial records, social media accounts, and personal relationships, searching for any indication that their disappearance might have been voluntary or the result of domestic problem. They found nothing. David and Emily Harrison had been genuinely happy, genuinely excited about their coming child, genuinely looking forward to their camping trip. Their marriage was solid, their finances stable, their plans for the future well established. There was no reason for them to disappear voluntarily, and every reason for them to return home safely. 6 months after the disappearance, the case was transferred from active search and rescue to cold case investigation. Emily's due date came and went without any sign of the family that should have been. Jessica Harrison Chen organized annual memorial hikes to keep her sister's case in the public eye. But as years passed, media attention faded, and the mystery of what happened to David, Emily, and their unborn child became just another unsolved case file in a cabinet full of unsolved case files. But cold cases don't stay cold forever, especially when the evidence is still out there waiting for someone to find it. Marcus Rodriguez had been hiking alone in Joshua Tree for over 20 years, and he thought he knew every hidden canyon, every secret trail, every spot where the desert revealed something unexpected to those patient enough to look carefully. As a retired geology professor from UC Riverside, Rodriguez approached desert exploration with scientific methodology, systematic, thorough, respectful of both the environment and its dangers. On October 15, 2024, Rodriguez was following a wash that most hikers never discovered, a narrow channel carved by flash floods through an area that didn't appear on standard trail maps. He was documenting rock formations for a research project about desert erosion patterns when something caught his eye that had nothing to do with geology. Wedged between two large boulders, partially concealed by debris that had accumulated over many years, was a small rectangular object that clearly didn't belong in the natural environment. When Rodriguez carefully extracted it from its hiding place, he realized he was holding a severely damaged digital camera, the kind that had been popular in the early 2010, but had been largely replaced by smartphones by 2024. The camera's case was cracked and faded by years of exposure to desert conditions, but the memory card was still intact. Rodriguez, understanding that he might have found evidence related to one of the many missing person cases in the park's history, carefully documented the location with GPS coordinates and photographs before hiking out to contact park authorities. Within hours, the camera was in the hands of digital forensics specialists at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. What they recovered from that damaged memory card would finally answer the question that had haunted investigators for 11 years. What happened to David and Emily Harrison? The camera contained 127 photos spanning what appeared to be several days in early October 2013. The first images were typical vacation shots. David and Emily arriving at Joshua Tree, setting up their campsite, taking selfies with the distinctive desert landscape in the background. Emily looked radiant in her maternity clothes, and David appeared relaxed and happy as they documented their baby moon adventure. But as investigators worked through the chronological sequence of images, they began to see a story that was far more sinister than a simple camping trip gone wrong. Photo 89, timestamped 11:43 p.m. on October 12th, showed the interior of their tent with Emily apparently sleeping while David held the camera. Nothing unusual about an expectant father documenting quiet moments of their last trip as a childless couple. Photo 90, timestamped 11:47 p.m., showed David's face in what appeared to be confusion or concern, as if he'd heard something outside their tent that shouldn't have been there. Photo 91 was where everything changed. Taken at 11:52 p.m., the image was blurry and dark, clearly shot in haste, but it showed something that made investigators' blood run cold. Through the tent's mesh window, barely visible in the darkness, were the silhouettes of at least 3 people standing around their campsite. People who had no legitimate reason to be there at midnight. People who appeared to be watching and waiting. The next 17 photos told a story that explained not just what happened to David and Emily Harrison, but revealed something far more disturbing. Their disappearance hadn't been random. They had been targeted, stalked, and taken by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Detective Sarah Martinez of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department had worked missing person cases for 15 years, but she'd never seen evidence like what the digital forensics team presented to her from the recovered camera. The photos suggested that David Harrison had somehow managed to document his own kidnapping in real time, capturing images even as the situation spiraled out of control. Photo 95 showed Emily being forcibly awakened by someone whose face wasn't visible in the frame, but whose presence was clearly threatening based on Emily's expression of terror. Photo 98 captured David's desperate attempt to call for help on his cell phone, but the timestamp corresponded to a location where cell service was known to be non-existent. Most chilling was photo 103, which showed Emily being led away from their campsite by two people whose faces were obscured by darkness, but whose body language suggested complete control over the situation. David had managed to photograph his pregnant wife being abducted, even as he was presumably being threatened himself. The final photos on the camera were the most disturbing and the most revealing. Taken over what appeared to be a period of several hours, they showed the Harrisons being transported through areas of the desert that were far from any established trails or roads. The images were frequently blurred, suggesting David was taking them surreptitiously while being moved, but they provided crucial information about the route their captors had taken. Photo 119 showed a structure that investigators initially didn't recognize, a building or compound that appeared to be hidden in a remote section of the desert, surrounded by natural rock formations that would make it nearly impossible to spot from the air. Photo 124 showed the interior of what appeared to be a room or cell, with Emily visible in the background, clearly in distress but apparently unharmed at the time the photo was taken. And photo 127, the final image on the camera, showed something that would redirect the entire investigation into David and Emily Harrison's disappearance. The photo was timestamped 4:33 a.m. on October 13th, nearly 5 hours after the first images of their abduction. It showed the face of one of their captors clearly for the first time, and when investigators ran facial recognition analysis, they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about this case. The man in the photo was Robert Sullivan, a former Park Service employee who'd been terminated 3 years earlier for inappropriate conduct involving female campers, but Sullivan wasn't just a disgruntled ex-employee acting alone. According to employment records that investigators pulled after identifying him, Sullivan had been part of a network of people who'd been systematically targeting isolated campers in remote areas of several national parks across California and Nevada. Detective Martinez expanded the investigation beyond Joshua Tree and discovered a pattern that had been invisible to individual park jurisdictions, but became clear when viewed comprehensively. Over a 7-year period from 2009 to 2016, 14 couples or small groups had disappeared from remote camping areas in national parks throughout the Southwest. In each case, the disappearances had characteristics similar to the Harrison case. No signs of struggle, no evidence of natural disaster or animal attack, and no trace of the victims despite extensive searches. But the Harrison case was different because David had managed to document what happened. His camera revealed that these weren't random disappearances or cases of people getting lost in the wilderness. They were abductions carried out by an organized group that specifically targeted isolated campers who were unlikely to be missed immediately and whose disappearances could be easily attributed to natural causes. The building shown in photo 119 became the focus of an intensive investigation. Using enhanced satellite imagery and the route suggested by David's photos, Investigators were able to identify a remote compound that had been constructed on private land adjacent to Joshua Tree National Park. The compound was registered to a shell corporation that traced back to Robert Sullivan and two associates, Michael Torres, a former security guard who'd worked at several national parks, and Janet Morrison, a woman who'd been employed in various administrative capacities at Park Service offices throughout California. But finding the compound and identifying the suspects was only the beginning. The investigation had revealed evidence of systematic abduction and murder, but what had happened to the victims? Where were David and Emily Harrison and their unborn child? Where were the other 13 couples who'd vanished over the 7 years that this operation had apparently been active? The answers to those questions would prove to be more disturbing than anyone involved in the investigation was prepared to discover. The compound that appeared in David Harrison's final photographs sat on 40 acres of private land that bordered Joshua Tree National Park, hidden among natural rock formations that made it virtually invisible from ground level and difficult to spot even from aircraft. When investigators approached with search warrants in November 2024, they found a facility that had been designed with one purpose: the systematic processing of human beings who had been abducted from remote camping areas. Detective Sarah Martinez had worked homicide cases for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for what the search team discovered at what they came to call the Sullivan compound. The facility contained holding cells, medical equipment, and most disturbing of all, detailed records documenting the fate of dozens of people who'd been brought there over a 7-year period. Robert Sullivan, Michael Torres, and Janet Morrison had been running what federal investigators would later describe as a human processing operation, abducting isolated campers and selling them into various forms of trafficking depending on their perceived value. Young couples were the preferred targets because they were less likely to be immediately missed and more valuable to the criminal networks that purchased trafficking victims. Emily Harrison's pregnancy had made her particularly valuable. According to the records found at the compound, pregnant women were sold to illegal adoption rings that specialized in providing infants to wealthy clients who were willing to pay premium prices to avoid legal adoption processes. The women were held until they gave birth. Then the children were taken, and the mothers were typically sold into labor trafficking operations where their eventual fate was uncertain. The records were meticulous and horrifying. Each victim was cataloged with photographs, physical descriptions, and notations about their processing status. The Harrison case file indicated that Emily had been classified as premium maternity inventory, while David had been designated for labor/disposal track, depending on his cooperation with the operation. But the records also revealed something that gave investigators hope. The operation had been shut down abruptly in March 2016, when Sullivan and his associates had apparently learned that federal investigators were getting close to discovering their activities. Rather than risk capture, they had liquidated their assets and scattered, leaving the compound abandoned but with evidence intact. Most importantly, the records suggested that not all of the victims had been killed. Some had been sold into trafficking operations where they might still be alive, though enslaved and living under false identities in locations that could be anywhere in the world. Federal authorities launched what they called Operation Desert Rescue, a multi-agency investigation aimed at tracking down Sullivan and his associates while simultaneously attempting to locate and rescue any surviving victims of their operation. The investigation expanded across multiple states and eventually involved international law enforcement agencies as the scope of the trafficking network became clear. The break in the case came 6 months later, when Janet Morrison was arrested in Phoenix while attempting to access funds from a bank account linked to the operation. Under interrogation, Morrison revealed details about the trafficking network that led to raids in 12 cities and the rescue of 17 people who'd been living as enslaved labor in various industries. Among those rescued was Maria Santos, a young woman who disappeared while camping with her boyfriend in Death Valley National Park in 2014. Santos had been sold to a labor trafficking ring and had spent 10 years working in agricultural operations in Central California under the constant threat of violence. Her rescue provided investigators with detailed information about how the Sullivan operation had worked and where other victims might be located. But the question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation remained unanswered. What had happened to David and Emily Harrison and their unborn child? The records from the compound indicated that Emily had been held there for approximately 3 weeks after her abduction, during which time she had been provided with prenatal care to ensure the health of the child she was carrying. David had been kept in a separate section of the facility, apparently as leverage to ensure Emily's cooperation. According to the documentation, Emily had given birth to a daughter on November 2, 2013, 3 weeks before her official due date. The child had been classified as premium newborn inventory and had been transferred to what the records described as a high-value placement network 2 days after birth. Emily and David Harrison had been classified for secondary market processing on November 5, 2013, which investigators understood to mean they had been sold to a trafficking operation that specialized in forced labor. The records indicated they had been transported to a location identified only as Northwest Agricultural Processing Facility on November 8, 2013. Using financial records seized from the compound and banking information provided by Morrison, investigators were able to trace payments to a labor trafficking operation in Washington state that had been using undocumented workers and trafficking victims to staff large-scale agricultural operations in remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. In March 2025, federal agents raided 17 separate facilities across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California that were connected to the trafficking network that had purchased David and Emily Harrison 11 years earlier. The raids resulted in the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims who'd been living in conditions of modern slavery, forced to work in agricultural operations while being held prisoner through threats, violence, and debt bondage. Among those rescued were David and Emily Harrison. After 11 years of captivity, the couple was found living in a labor camp in rural Oregon, working under false identities and constant supervision. Emily had been forced to work in food processing facilities, while David had been assigned to agricultural labor. Both had been told that their daughter had died during birth and that they would be killed if they tried to escape or contact their families. The physical and psychological trauma they had endured was severe, but they were alive. More importantly, they learned that their daughter was also alive. The child, now 10 years old and known by the name Anna, had been placed with a wealthy family in Europe through the illegal adoption network that had purchased her from Sullivan's operation. The adoptive parents had been told that Anna was the child of a young mother who died in childbirth and that the adoption was being facilitated through a legitimate international agency. When European authorities contacted the adoptive family and explained the true circumstances of Anna's placement, the family cooperated fully with efforts to reunite her with her biological parents. The adoptive parents had genuinely believed the adoption was legal and had provided Anna with a loving home, education, and opportunities that had allowed her to thrive despite the traumatic circumstances of her birth. The reunion between David, Emily, and their daughter took place at a secure facility in Oregon in April 2025, under the supervision of trauma specialists and family therapists who understood the complex psychological challenges involved in reuniting a family that had been separated by trafficking for over a decade. But the story didn't end with rescue and reunion. The investigation had revealed a trafficking network that had operated for years, destroying countless lives and generating millions of dollars in profits for criminal organizations. Robert Sullivan and Michael Torres had been killed during arrest operations. Sullivan while attempting to flee across the border into Mexico, Torres during a raid on a safe house in Nevada. The broader network of people who had facilitated, supported, and profited from the operation remained to be prosecuted. Over 150 people were eventually charged in connection with the trafficking operation, including corrupt officials who had helped cover up the disappearances, business owners who had knowingly employed trafficking victims, and financial operators who had laundered money generated by the criminal enterprise. On October 12, 2025, exactly 12 years after David and Emily Harrison disappeared from their campsite in Joshua Tree, they returned to the same location with their daughter Anna for a ceremony that would finally bring closure to one of the most disturbing cases in National Park Service history. The Harrison family's return to Joshua Tree wasn't just a personal milestone. It was the culmination of the largest human trafficking investigation in the history of the American Southwest. Operation Desert Rescue had resulted in the rescue of over 300 trafficking victims, the arrest of 187 suspects, and the dismantling of a criminal network that had operated across multiple states for nearly a decade. Emily Harrison, now 42 years old, stood at the same picnic table where she'd once researched baby names while pregnant with the daughter she wouldn't meet for 10 years. The physical scars from her ordeal were mostly hidden, but the psychological ones would take years of therapy to heal. Still, she was alive, she was free, and she was finally able to hold the child who'd been taken from her moments after birth. David Harrison, whose quick thinking to photograph their abduction had ultimately led to their rescue, had struggled with survivors' guilt over the 11 years of captivity that his wife and daughter had endured because of his decision to document what was happening rather than fight their attackers, but therapists had helped him understand that his decision to create evidence had not only saved their lives, but had also made possible the rescue of hundreds of other trafficking victims. Anna Harrison, who had lived her first 10 years as Anna Bergstrom, with adoptive parents in Sweden, was a bright, multilingual child who was slowly learning about her true origins while maintaining connections to the family who'd raised her with love and care. The complexity of her situation required ongoing support from specialists in international adoption and family reunification, but she was resilient and curious about the parents she was meeting for the first time. The ceremony at Joshua Tree included families of other trafficking victims who'd been rescued as a result of the investigation that began with Marcus Rodriguez finding a damaged camera in a desert wash. Maria Santos, who'd survived 10 years of agricultural labor trafficking, spoke about the importance of never giving up hope that missing loved ones might still be alive. Detective Sarah Martinez received a commendation for her work on the case, but she emphasized that the real heroes were the victims who'd survived and the family members who'd never stopped searching for answers. But perhaps the most important moment of the ceremony came when Emily Harrison addressed the gathered crowd of survivors, family members, law enforcement officials, and media representatives. For 11 years, people told us that David and I were probably dead, she said, her voice steady but emotional. They said that the desert was too harsh, that we'd gotten lost, that we'd made mistakes that cost us our lives. But the truth is that we didn't make mistakes. We were victims of people who viewed us as commodities to be bought and sold. She paused, looking out at the desert landscape that had once seemed beautiful and peaceful, but had hidden such terrible secrets. The camera that David used to document our abduction saved not just our lives, but the lives of hundreds of other people who were trapped in the same system of modern slavery. But that camera wouldn't have mattered if Marcus Rodriguez hadn't found it, if Detective Martinez hadn't taken it seriously, if federal investigators hadn't followed every lead no matter how disturbing. Emily's message was clear. Trafficking operations like the one that had destroyed her family counted on silence, invisibility, and the assumption that missing people had simply made fatal mistakes rather than fallen victim to organized crime. The Harrison case had succeeded in exposing the truth only because multiple people had refused to accept the simple explanations and had insisted on digging deeper. The financial impact of Operation Desert Rescue extended far beyond the individual rescues. The investigation had uncovered a trafficking network that generated an estimated $50 million annually through the sale of abducted campers into various forms of modern slavery. The criminal enterprise had operated by specifically targeting people whose disappearances were likely to be attributed to natural causes rather than criminal activity. National park officials announced new safety protocols designed to make it more difficult for criminals to target isolated campers. These included enhanced communication systems, mandatory check-in procedures for backcountry camping, and improved coordination between Park Service personnel and law enforcement agencies in missing person cases. But Emily Harrison's final words at the ceremony addressed the broader implications of their case. If you take anything from our story, let it be this: when someone goes missing, especially in remote areas, don't assume they made mistakes. Don't assume they got lost or had accidents. Ask hard questions. Demand thorough investigations, and never, ever give up hope that they might still be alive and waiting for rescue. The desert kept David Harrison's evidence safe for 11 years until someone was ready to find it. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but it never stops moving. If this story has taught you anything about the reality of human trafficking in America, share it. If you know someone whose disappearance was dismissed too quickly, speak up. If you've ever felt like the authorities weren't taking a missing person case seriously enough, remember that families like the Harrisons need advocates who won't give up. Your voice matters, your attention matters. Your refusal to accept easy explanations could be what saves someone's life. Comment below if you think every missing person deserves the kind of investigation that finally brought the Harrison family home. And if you're ever camping in remote areas, remember, trust your instincts, stay connected with people who will notice if you don't check in, and know that sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones with claws and fangs. The Harrison family spent 12 years separated by a criminal network that counted on being invisible. Today, they're together because people refuse to let them stay invisible. That's the power of never giving up on the truth.